Mirrors by Greensearcher, Chapter 15. Joyeux Noël, Gaston. Gaston continued to examine his reflection in his knife-sharp blade, digging a bit of meat out of one tooth with his tongue before sighing in satisfaction and flinging the knife straight into the centre of a dartboard across the empty tavern. He sensed someone moving closer, spotting a parcel drop onto the table beside him. He glanced up. "Ah, Paulette," he noted. The girl frowned. "Claudette." Gaston shrugged. He didn't really care which one it was. Any one of them was good enough to at least keep him distracted until Belle came around. He simpered, grabbing the girl's wrist and tugging her down onto his lap. Claudette giggled a little, and Gaston didn't hesitate in putting her mouth against his and letting his hands roam over several places they shouldn't. "Gaston, wait!" she gasped, reaching for the package on the table and holding it up between them. He huffed, doubting this could be better than what they could be doing, but tearing open the paper nonetheless. He tugged out something soft and red. A tiny swath of fabric. It looked completely useless. He heard a quiet whimper across the room, looking up to see the other two triplets watching from near the door. The one in the green dress was crying into her hands, while the other one in amber was leaning against the door frame, arms crossed and staring at Gaston with narrow eyes. "They're infant linens," Claudette explained nervously. He looked back up at her and frowned. Stupid woman. What made her think he would want something like this? Claudette bit her lip before going on. "Gaston, I'm with child," she said quietly. "You're going to be a father." Gaston was silent for a long moment, then roughly pushed her off his lap. She stood on unsteady feet, her quiet excitement slowly being replaced by confusion. Then hurt. Of course, Gaston didn't notice either of these, standing up and dropping the ridiculous gift into her hands. "You're confused," he stated. "That's just not possible." Her eyes grew wide. But we did nothing," he said darkly. He suddenly pulled on his best smirk, rubbing her head and undoing several of her carefully placed curls. "I know how much you like me." "Who wouldn't?" He laughed cruelly. "But I'm gonna marry Belle. See? Can't go around taking on every whore who went and got herself into trouble." Claudette flinched at his words, enormous tears starting to spill down her face. But you said you cared about me," she choked out. Gaston hummed, bringing a hand to his thick chin. She was probably telling the truth. He usually said whatever it took to get what he wanted. He had grown quite good at that, in fact. He heard footsteps, then the triplet in yellow moved over and quickly wrapped her arm around her sister. She glared at him, her pretty face distorting as she wrinkled her nose. "You have to provide for her at least," this new one said. "She can't marry now. Not after this." Claudette started to sob, but Gaston merely let out a bark of laughter. "Not my problem." The sister in yellow clenched her teeth. We'll tell everyone what you've done. We'll..." She stopped, gasping as a large hand struck her across the face and knocked her to the floor. "Laurette!" Claudette cried, falling to her knees beside her sister. The third one, Paulette by default, ran over, stopping and looking up at Gaston in fear before dropping down beside them. Gaston was no longer smiling, pulling his hand back and clenching his fist. How dare this woman talk back to him? It made him want to strangle something. "You think they'll believe you?" he snarled. "What wench wouldn't tell such lies to be with the greatest man in town?" Laurette pushed herself onto trembling arms, eyes full of silent tears as her sisters steadied her. "You're not the greatest man in town, Gaston," she whispered. She glanced towards the window, huffing in dark amusement. Belle was the only one who saw it. She really was the smart one. Gaston frowned, trying to process that. Belle didn't think he was the greatest man in town. "Oh, that's because she thinks I'm the greatest man in the world," he realized, letting a wicked smirk cross his face once again as he stomped towards the door. The triplets flinched as he passed, but he paid them no mind. It was an unfortunate loss, but he'd been starting to get bored of them anyway. Besides, being as gorgeous as he was, He was never in need of admirers who could replace them. He threw open the tavern door, grabbing a rifle on the wall and welcoming the crisp morning air. A good hunt would clear his mind. He just needed to kill something. He smiled. He felt better just thinking about it, strutting across the town and accepting several mugs of warm ale from his sycophants, enjoying the Joyeux Noëls that came to him from across the square. Had he stayed behind a moment longer, however, he would have heard something of great interest to him. "We should have done what Belle did," Laurette breathed, skin tender beneath her bruising cheek as her eyes followed him out of the door. "We should have run far away from you." Line break.
"You have to close your eyes."
Belle raised a brow, standing beside Adam in the hallway just outside the library, a pretty red nightgown sticking out from beneath her robe. He had also forgone getting dressed that morning, throwing on his robe over loose trousers he'd slept in before racing down at first light to set up her gift.
"It's a surprise,"
he clarified, grinning at Belle's expression. "But didn't you wrap it?" she asked.
"I couldn't wrap this."
"What in the world?" she wondered aloud, though she bit her lip in excitement and closed her eyes obediently. He pushed open the door, reaching for her hands and pulling her slowly into the room. The chatter of voices met them, much of the household already awake and having seen the gift already, were nearly as eager to see her reaction as he was. "Can I open them?" Belle asked, head moving towards the sound of the others. A few people laughed.
No, not yet,"
Adam said, guiding her beside the tree, before dropping her hands.
"Wait here." He rushed over and tugged the large curtains further open, letting the scene of freshly falling snow paint the backdrop before spinning around, rearranging his gift one last time. "Now can I open them?" "All right,"
he agreed, sucking in a breath.
"Now."
Belle opened her eyes, blinking against the light before her eyes swept across the room and fell to the easel on display beside the tree. A large canvas was secured in place, several others leaning against its side with a half-dozen smaller packages resting on the floor. "Oh," she breathed, taking a step closer, stopping and bringing her hands to her cheeks. "Oh! Oh!"
You like it?"
Adam asked hesitantly. "Like it?" She laughed, rushing over and sitting on the stool at the easel's side. She ran over fingers until the smooth, polished frame, bringing her hands to her face once again. "It's wonderful!" Adam beamed. "Where did you get it?" she asked in shock, tearing her eyes from the gift to look up at him.
"Well, he started,
rubbing the back of his neck.
"He made it!" someone cried, a few chuckles behind them.
Belle's mouth fell open, looking back at Adam for confirmation. He shrugged a bit shyly, eyes growing wide at the last moment as she rushed over and flung her arms around his neck. He'd have made her 100 of them just for that. "Can we go in now, Mama?" a muffled voice came from the hall. Everyone laughed, and Adam followed Belle's gaze towards the door, his arm sneaking around her waist.
"All right, Mrs. Potts, you can send them in,"
he called out. Not a second later, a teacup came bounding into the library, spinning to a stop at the base of the tree before diving into the pile of gifts. A couple of horse brushes and a large bucket rolled alongside them, the stable boys nearly as eager as Chip to finally see what awaited them under the tree. "Slow down, Chip," Mrs. Potts chided, following them in atop Anne's tray. "Let the master pass them out. Some of those are to share, I believe." Adam smirked, looking back down at Belle.
"Will you help me? Then you can open the rest."
Belle glanced down, as if just realizing there were more gifts at her feet. She bit her lip in excitement, nodding as they moved towards the others. The boards were a hit. A half-dozen set up within a quarter of an hour that drew several crowds of adults, who watched with as much interest as the children played. Belle taught everyone the rules of the games, and Adam found himself teaming up with Chip for a couple of rounds, before the boy felt confident enough to play on his own. His laughter rang out in the large room as Adam and Belle snuck away. Belle sat back at her new easel, touching it with reverence. Adam wondered if she had guessed what the remaining packages was.
"Here,"
he said, handing one of them up to her. Belle bit her lip excitedly as she untied the string, unwrapping the gift with care so as not to wrinkle the wrapping.
"You can't just tear the paper,"
Adam chuckled. Belle cocked her head at him. "Tear it? But then, how will you use it next year?" Adam blinked, then felt a moment of guilt. Were wrappings something people usually saved? He never had.
Not as a child, anyway. He pursed his lips, realizing the palace's material challenges over the last decade were nothing compared to what Belle had lived on her whole life.
Sorry, I forgot about that,
he said quietly. Belle finished unwrapping the gift, a dozen tubes of paint falling into her lap. Her delight was more than enough to make him smile again.
I did have help getting these, I'll admit, he noted.
Belle looked up, raising a brow. Wait a minute. Were we ever actually missing Ginger? Adam grinned sheepishly.
No.
He caught Sophie snickering somewhere behind him. I knew you two were acting suspicious, Belle grinned, taking the next parcel from Adam's hands and opening it with a haste. Oh! She cried again, revealing the small box full of watercolours. Her reaction was much the same as for the others, barely able to look at the new brushes, paints and palette without covering her face in shock. She soon had all of them gathered in her arms, pressing the supplies fondly against her chest, unable to stop smiling.
One more thing, Adam started.
Oh, Adam, this is too much, she insisted. He only grinned, glancing towards the floor.
Master Pascal?
The stool beneath Belle shifted, and Belle jumped up in alarm. I'm so sorry, she cried. I didn't realise that was you, monsieur.
The stool only chuckled. Do not be alarmed, mademoiselle. I am simply here upon our lord's request to offer you an apprenticeship, if you so desire.
Belle blinked, looking at Adam in confusion.
Master Pascal was trained for many years in Florence, he explained. He was our palace artisan before the curse.
Ah, yes, the man went on. If only I had been holding a paintbrush instead of resting upon this cursed stool at the time. Perhaps I could have continued to be of use all these years, he said with regret.
Nonetheless, I am quite impressed by your skill, my dear. You have potential to be a great master, I believe.
Belle sucked in a shallow breath. But I'm a woman, she said hesitantly. I've never heard of a female master.
You may not have heard of them, but they exist. Though many would like to believe that they do not.
Pascal went on before sighing.
I am ashamed, but to admit, that I once held a similar mindset. But I have come to see that the only reason we rarely see the female contribution in such things is because we refuse to instruct you.
Belle looked close to tears. You'll really teach me? She asked, still uncertain.
With pleasure, my child, the man assured her. In fact, I would not be surprised if you taught me a thing or two.
Thank you, she said, looking thoroughly overwhelmed, as 2 quiet tears slipped down her cheeks. Thank you, Adam, she breathed more earnestly, hugging the supplies closer to her heart and pressing her face into his chest. He wrapped his arms slowly around her, Bron prepared for this situation. To think she'd be so shocked at a chance for a position she was more than qualified for. But then he realised his own mother's passion for the arts. She'd been self-taught, hadn't she? Why hadn't she gone to university? Perhaps she couldn't. Adam furrowed his brows, wondering what it would feel like to be a woman born into this world and denied any opportunity to grow in the ways you wished. And suddenly, even with everything he had been through, this seemed to be the most humbling. Belle pulled back, attempting to dry her eyes, but letting a few brushes slip from her arms in the process. She caught them quickly, laughing a little and resting the supplies carefully beside the easel before looking back up at him. I'm afraid my gift is quite humble compared to yours, she grimaced. Adam shook his head, watching as she stepped carefully to the back of the tree. A few moments later she returned, a medium-sized parcel in her hands. They sat on the rug, the sounds of young laughter behind them as Belle handed him the gift. Adam remembered not to tear the wrapping, letting it fall away and staring at the pile of novels in his lap. He smiled, unsurprised, lifting up the first and turning to the title page. It was an adventure novel of sorts, and despite having a library filled to the brim, this was one he had never seen before. He felt a bit of excitement in his chest. They were all published, or at least widely circulated within the last decade, Belle explained nervously. I checked. None of them are in your library. I'm sorry they're so worn, though. I didn't feel right using your own money to get you a gift. It was then Adam's eyes caught something written on the inside cover. Belle Dupont, it said in careful cursive, though her handwriting looked different. Younger.
He pulled out the next, and saw the name once again written in, indicating its owner.
Belle, these are yours, he realised.
The pages were slightly yellowed, the bindings worn, indicating their use. Belle had shown him her home once, through the mirror, and he recalled the old bookshelf beside their small hearth. It looked like it had once housed several dozen works, though only a small fraction remained after selling the rest to try to care for her mother. Adam looked down at the 5 books sitting on his lap. They must be nearly all she had left. "It's all right," she was saying. "I've read them so many times, I probably have them memorized by now." Adam knew she was playing it down. Belle's books were some of her few and most prized possessions, and the condition of these revealed how very much they had been loved by their owner. And while their monetary worth might have been minimal, Adam knew he was holding a great treasure. "I know you don't really need more books," she went on, staring into her lap, "but I wasn't sure what else I could." She was cut off as he pulled her into a tight hug.
"This,"
he started, pulling back and looking down at her,
"is the best gift I've ever received."
She sighed in relief, eyes brightening as she smiled up at him. How could she have been so worried? Didn't she realize anything and everything she did made him happy?
Wow, I am really in deep,
he realized, smiling dumbly to himself. He looked back down at the books, grinning to himself. He really was excited to read them.
"So, which one should I start with?"
Line break. An old workhorse plodded along the northern pass, his rider fidgeting anxiously with the reins.
"What am I doing?"
he asked aloud for the umpteenth time, yanking roughly on the reins and turning the old steed slowly around. He stopped, however, the thought of that sweet voice making his heart swell once again.
"Already made it this far, right, boy?"
Henry asked, turning the horse back towards Molyneux and giving it a good pat on the neck. The horse only huffed, no doubt sick of his rider's indecision. Half a mile later, the road turned sharply south, hugging the edge of the woods to his left. Henry stopped, looking around. It was different than he had remembered it. Though it had been years, it would be hard to forget this place. He stared into the dark woods, the old path almost completely covered in young growth. Momentarily forgetting his objective, he slipped from the saddle, falling heavily into the snow and taking several steps away from the road. He stopped just beyond the trees, sucking in a nervous breath. No guards blocked his way anymore, but he had long since feared something else that lay within these trees. Line break. Flashback.
25, 26, 27.
Henry crouched in the dark trees, an old stopwatch in one hand counting the seconds between each guard rotation. He couldn't see the clock face itself, but if he held still, he could feel the gentle tick of the clock hand as it vibrated against his palm. He wouldn't fail this time. He had been watching Victor's guards for a solid week now, resisting the urge to sprint through the trees when an opportunity seemingly presented itself. That hadn't worked in the past, nor had charging in on a stolen steed, and Charles was right. If he was caught one more time, he'd be facing worse than the stocks. No, he had to be more careful. This was his last chance, and tonight he was going to take it. His heart seemed to pound in his throat, and he was suddenly struck with nerves, watching as the same patterns of the guards for another hour before gaining the courage to move. The light of a lantern broke through the thick trees, a guard winding his way through the brush and disappearing less than a minute later. Just as the light began to fade, Henry stood, legs aching from crouching for so long. He ignored that, stepping as quietly as his heavy frame would let him, relying on the moonlight to guide him, past the place the man had just moved, and into the depths of the forest beyond.
27, 28.
A new light appeared behind him, and Henry tucked himself silently behind an old oak. He had made it further than he had planned, but his heart still raced until the light disappeared once again. Henry repeated the process, gaining but a dozen paces with each pass of the guard. It made for slow progress, but he couldn't risk making any noise. He forced himself to be patient, forced himself to feel the soft ticking against his palm, to scan for the best place to hide, and giving himself plenty of time before that light appeared once again. Besides, even with the full moon, it was difficult to move through the thick brush without alerting anyone of his presence, and the moonlight itself was like a double-edged sword in his belt. Though it helped him navigate without a lantern of his own, it only increased the chance of him being spotted. A quarter mile in, and he started to relax. Another, and he'd abandoned the pocket watch altogether, standing tall and staring into the dark forest. The glow of the guards' lanterns was too far away now to be visible. And so was he.
I made it!
Henry realized, feeling the tears burn in his eyes. He shook his head quickly. He wasn't there yet, and still wasn't sure what he would find once he made it. He pulled the sword from his hip, unwinding the thick cloth that had muffled the sound before replacing it in its sheath. He did the same with a small lantern, pulling 2 spark rocks from his pouch and lighting the wick before standing once again and looking around. He'd always thought these woods quite beautiful in the light. He'd spent many summer evenings wandering the trails while courting Virginie, at least when she'd been well enough to. Though she grew tired, he'd just pick up her petite frame and carry her back to the palace in his arms. He sucked in a breath, blinking roughly.
Best not think about that now.
He looked ahead once again. The woods no longer held their former beauty for him, but were now a fortress, a prison for the innocent that had nearly been impenetrable until this night. He frowned, quickening his pace as he sought for the main path.
Crunch!
He grimaced at the noise, looking around nervously before lifting his foot to see what he had stepped on. But there was nothing but dry grass beneath his boots.
Crunch!
He heard it again, but paces away, and his heart fell into his chest.
He wasn't alone,
and he had a feeling whoever it was here was more dangerous than a soldier and a musket. The growling came next, and Henry set the lantern down, reaching for the blade at his belt with a trembling hand. The wolf's face appeared a moment later, teeth glinting in the moonlight, body thin, eyes hungry.
You won't take me,
Henry breathed, gripping the sword he could barely use in both hands.
Not tonight. I'm getting my son back, see?
The wolf paused, as though considering his words, but soon tossed back its head and howled. Another called back, echoing across the darkness. Then several more, each closer than the last. Henry bolted at the first howl, racing as fast as he could through the darkness, tripping over invisible roots and scratching up his arms on spindly branches. He was broad and strong, useful for hauling barrels or pounding a heavy mallet repeatedly against hot iron. Not so useful when one needed to dash quickly and quietly through the trees. The wolves were on him in minutes, surrounding him on 3 sides and forcing him in the opposite direction.
Where had they all come from?
Lost and gasping for breath, Henry pushed against the burning in his legs and looked around in desperation for something he could climb. Yet none of these great trees' branches were within his reach. He heard a snap of sharp jowls just behind him, crying out in surprise. They were upon him again, and in his shock and exhaustion he tripped over an invisible root at his feet.
No!
He cried, watching at the moment of horror as a pack of wolves bolted towards him once again. Bang! The gunshot was harsh against his ears, but Henry took the chance and quickly scrambled to his feet, looking around. Deep yells rang out from the darkness, and 6 lanterns moving swiftly in the air towards him. Another shot was fired, and he ducked, covering his head.
Damn it! He thought. Those creatures led me right back to the start.
He watched the wolves beginning to flee at the gunshots, tempted to run off with them rather than be caught by the guards once more. One more time.
What should I do?
He wondered desperately. Would it be better to run, or try to hide before they spotted? Before he could finish the thought, a hard force rammed into the back of his head from the behind. All went black. Line breaks still in the flashback. Henry woke up to a throbbing headache. He lifted a hand to his skull, feeling a large lump shaped like the barrel of a gun. His arms felt heavy, thick chains encasing his wrists and ankles.
His heart sank into his stomach.
I failed. If I'd have known it was you, I would have left you to the wolves.
Henry looked up. He recognised this guard. A middle-aged fellow, a patchy beard across his cheeks. A sick look in his eyes that made Henry's stomach turn. He looked like the kind of man he'd keep every woman and child in the world far away from.
Though perhaps it was best. I'm doubling my wages this month thanks to you.
The man went on with a sneer.
What?
Henry asked. The guard just reached down and unlocked his restraints. Though confused, Henry didn't dare question it, letting the man tug the chains away and pull him roughly to his feet.
This is a one-time deal,
the guard went on, letting go of Henry's arms and shoving him forward.
He comes around here again, and we shoot him on the spot. Understood? Of course, an older man replied.
Henry looked up, blinking against the morning lights. On the path stood old Armand, the blacksmith who had taught him all he knew.
Master,
he said, bowing his head in shame.
Come on, son. Can't fill those orders today without you,
he said blankly, turning his back to them and heading back down to the path towards the village. Henry followed in silence for several long minutes, frustrated and embarrassed, but also immeasurably grateful. He wasn't a fool. He knew the old man had bribed the guard for his release.
I owe you a great debt, master,
he said quietly. The man grunted, scratching at his straggly white beard.
I'll take it out of your inheritance.
My what? Armand stopped, letting Henry catch up.
I've never had an apprentice as skilled as you, lad. Nor one so good at heart, he admitted.
Henry's eyes grew wide in surprise.
You know I have no children, the man went on, so I'll be leaving you all I got once I leave this wretched world.
Henry stopped. He didn't know what to say.
But I can't do that if you're in prison, Armand continued, frowning. Or dead.
Henry stared at the ground.
I can't abandon them, master. I know,
the man went on.
And that makes me like you all the more. But what good are you to him? If you go off and get yourself shot? What good am I if I give him up?
Armand sighed.
Henry, what do you expect to find in there?
The image of rotting corpses, of bones heaped upon the earth, flashed in Henry's mind. He shook his head roughly. He couldn't think like that.
They have to be alive,
he said, half to himself.
Why else would Victor be guarding them so heavily? He has something to hide.
Armand turned to him.
Have you ever considered that he could be telling the truth? He prodded. That there really is a demon lurking in those woods?
Henry huffed in disbelief.
That's impossible. It might not be as impossible as you think.
Henry raised a brow, and his old master's expression grew solemn.
I didn't want to tell you this, son. You've already felt the grief of one twice your age. But maybe you need to know.
No, what? Henry asked nervously. Armand pursed his lips, but went on.
Had a nephew some years back. Not unlike the prodigal son, that one. Could always find him at some pub or another, wasting my late brother's coin on woman and ale. Then, one night, we found him, lying on a side street, sitting in a pool of his own blood.
Henry sucked in a breath.
Master, I'm sorry. Bah! The boy had it coming, he said roughly, glaring at the road ahead. It wasn't the murder that surprised anyone. He worked up a dozen gambling debts across the countryside. But the way we found him? Well, no angry creditor could have done that.
How do you know? Henry asked.
Armand looked back at him darkly. His heart was gone. Torn straight from his chest.
Henry's eyes grew wide.
An animal, he breathed. No, Armand said. That was too precise to be done by a wild beast. Though, whoever did it wasn't fully human either.
Henry's mouth grew dry. His master sighed, glancing back at the woods behind him.
Son, the worst you've imagined. Well, that might be nothing compared to what you actually find.
Henry felt sick, following his master's gaze towards the dark, wooded hills. It was no longer just a fortress to break through, now. but a place of his worst nightmares. Maybe Armand was right. Maybe going back would only bring him more heartbreak.
I know it's hard, but you gotta accept that they're gone. It's the only way you'll start healing.
Henry clenched his fists at his side, fighting the moisture in his eyes. He knew his master was right. All logic and reason told him he should stop his foolish ventures into these woods. But he couldn't push it away. Not that feeling in his chest that Jack was still alive.
No, he had to. It was only wishful thinking, wasn't it? Everyone else had accepted the facts. Maybe it was time he did it too. His son was dead. Heart flooding with sorrow. He had denied it for months. Henry nodded slowly and ducked his head in defeat. Yes, master.
End of flashback. Henry stared at the woods, feeling that old shame and heartache flood his chest once again. The soldiers had finally departed a couple of years after his last attempt, and not one lost soul had emerged from those woods. Any small hope he had clung to that they were alive had been crushed at that. He didn't think he could bear to find the remains of those deceased, those consumed by the wolves or killed by some strange demon, or simply murdered at the hands of his king. No, he wasn't strong enough to go back then. But now, could he really continue to live without knowing the truth? Even a painful one? Line break. Peaceful noises filled the large library. Several games continued into the afternoon, a crowd of women chatting happily, a dozen older servants snoozing along the furniture scattered across the room. Adam and Belle sat beside the tree, munching on gingerbread as he showed her how to fold up the new easel. "Do you think I could take it to Abel's Peak?" Belle asked excitedly.
"Sure," Adam said proudly. "And to unfold it again, you just unclasp this."
He stopped, ears suddenly twitching atop his head. He stood abruptly, catching some distant sound from beyond the tall windows. The sound of heavy footfalls in the snow. The footfalls of a man. Or perhaps a witch in disguise. "Adam?" Belle started nervously.
"What's away from the windows?"
he cried, rushing over as several servants scattered and tugged the thick curtains shut. Darkness fell over the room, but a few candles illuminating the space that had once been flooded with early morning light. He felt his heart in his throat as he turned around.
"Is anyone outside?"
"I don't believe so, master."
"Someone start a head count," he ordered roughly. "And where's Chip?"
I'm right here," the boy said nervously, his small clinking ringing out from behind Sophie's heel where he had ducked to hide.
"Everyone to the west!"
Adam stopped, hearing the footfalls hitting stone. The intruder was at the steps already.
"Damn it, there's no time! Stay here," he directed. "Keep quiet and blow out those candles as soon as I leave."
If there's no light, then at least there's no reflections, he thought quickly, glancing towards the shimmering ornaments decorating the trees. They were small, but who knew what the enchantress was really capable of? The calls of his guards rang out from the corridors then. They must be engaging the man at the doors already. A moment later, Adam felt a hand on his arm in the darkness. Belle looked up at him, eyes flashing with concern.
"I need to go,"
he told her, digging a hand into his pocket and pulling out a ring of keys. He pressed it into her hands. She inhaled anxiously, but nodded. "Be careful," she breathed. Out in the hall, Adam caught the sound of the lock turning behind him. He shouted towards the guards he passed to come to his aid, as he bolted on all fours towards the grand hall. The front doors remained shut, several sentries pointing towards them fiercely, rough orders being called out on their opposite side. Adam approached, pulling the door open without hesitation. If this was the enchantress, a pair of wooden doors wouldn't stop her. And if only a man, then, well, he could handle that alone. The man stood at the base of the steps, though his footprints shone in the snow up until the threshold. The guards had managed to back him off this far then. He held out a sword, simply but carefully crafted, his face contorting into terror at the assortment of spears and blades standing erect on the ground around him, pointing straight at his chest of their own accord. That terror, however, was nothing compared to the look that crossed his face at the sight of Adam.
"Oh, dear God!"
the man gasped, sword quaking in his grip. He reached up to steady with his other hand, though that didn't break his stance.
It was true. A demon. From hell itself. Look at me,
Adam ordered, his guards parting for him as he took 3 large strides closer to the man. The man only squeezed his eyes shut in response, entire body tensing as Adam closed the distance between them.
I won't ask again, Adam said roughly, flexing his claws. Show me your eyes, now.
The man obeyed, slowly opening his eyes, one at a time, before looking up. Brown orbs, not red, stared up at Adam. He sighed in relief. The man seemed to have regained himself at that, standing at his full height.
So you're the one who took him,
he said, his face contorting in pain as he held the sword aloft once more. Adam frowned.
What? My wife's mother? My son?
He said, his eyes suddenly full of tears.
You're the reason they're gone.
Line break. A quiet sniffle rang from the dark library, a small teacup trembling in Sophie's hands. I didn't mean to make the master mad, Chip choked out. Oh, sweetie, he's not angry with you, Sophie said gently. Sometimes people can seem upset when they're just really frightened. Master's frightened? Chip asked in confusion. But he's so big and strong. What does he have to be scared of? Sophie sensed a presence settle beside them. I can't take this any longer, Belle whispered, sucking in a breath in the darkness. Oh, I wish he would come back already. It'll be all right, love. I'm certain it was just a false alarm. Mrs. Potts's voice echoed from nearby. Despite her words, even her voice held a slight tremor to Sophie. It didn't usually hear from the older woman. Suddenly, several loud, angry voices seeped through the windows. The occupants in the library seemed to tense at once, and Belle jumped up, sprinting towards the window. Mademoiselle! Cogsworth's voice called out nervously. Belle paused. I'll be careful, she stated, ducking her head around the edge and being careful not to let any light into the room. A moment later she gasped, the curtains rustling as she stepped back. What is it? Sophie asked. It's Henry, Belle said quietly. From Beaumont. Henry Bullard. Another gasp rang out from the darkness, and Mrs. Potts's voice was unmistakable. What? What did you say?
Line break. You killed them, didn't you? The man said through clenched teeth. Murdered the first good king this land has known. Consuming, he stopped gasping. Consuming all the left hair, he shouted in rage, even as his tears spilled into his beard.
Adam blinked. He was obviously missing some vital information here, but he knew for a fact he had never consumed anyone.
A babe, the man went on, almost to himself. He was only a babe.
Frowning in concern, Adam motioned for the guards to back off, which they did reluctantly.
Look, he said carefully, holding up his paws in a sign of peace. Let me explain. I'm just a...
Henry! Heavy clanking rattled off the steps.
Sophie!
The man gasped, staring at her with wide eyes.
What are you? He stopped, shaking his head. Doesn't matter. You have to run. Take my horse. I'll hold it off as long as I can,
he said, thrusting the blade back towards Adam, in response to the spears surrounding him at once. Adam groaned, letting his face fall into his paw. He really hadn't handled this well at all, had he? Master, you have to call him off, Sophie cried. Please!
Sophie, you shouldn't be here, Adam called anxiously. You need to.
But he's Chip's father! Adam froze, his guard falling silent for a long, heavy moment.
What? He finally managed. Who?
The man added, looking just as confused. Jack! Sophie clarified, turning back to him. You're Jack's father, right, Henry? The man, Henry, it seemed, looked stunned.
But how did you...
Mrs. Potts told me. Henry breathed deeply for a long moment.
How do you know Beatrice?
We all know her, Sophie explained slowly. I heard what you said. But they weren't killed, Henry. They're alive, she said gently. And they're here. The sword slipped from Henry's fingertips, clattering to the stone.
He gasped, staring at her with wide eyes. My son. He's really... But it can't be.
Sophie pushed her way past the guards, resting a metal hand on the man's arm. "Come on! Let's go inside. I'll explain everything." Henry looked back nervously at Adam and the animate weapons around them, but only nodded. Clearly in shock, he let Sophie lead him up the stairs and into the castle. Line break.
"Well, it's me. You can open up."
A patter of feet sounded from the other side of the library door. "Tell me something only the real Adam would know," Belle's voice said from the other side.
"Ah, smart," Adam thought. He paused, thinking for a long moment, then smiling to himself. "As a boy, I had a pet salamander that escaped and found its way into Cogsworth's jacket pocket."
It caught Belle's quiet laughing on the other side. "Is that true?" she asked, voice muffled as she turned towards someone else. Cogsworth's response was unmistakable. "Unfortunately." The lock soon clicked, and she pulled open the door. Light from the hall spilled into the dark room, and before Adam could blink, Belle had wrapped her arms tightly around him. "I was worried," she said simply, voice muffled against him. She pulled back a moment later, looking back into the room. "And Mrs. Potts is beside herself," she whispered, watching as Sophie stepped quietly past them and into the larger room.
"I know. Sophie's going to talk to her before."
He stopped, glancing back where the man waited several paces away. Belle glanced around Adam's large form and smiled. "Bonjour, Henry," she said kindly. He just nodded, looking at the two of them in some bewilderment. His breathing was shallow, and he glanced anxiously towards the room Sophie had disappeared.
"He thought we were all dead,"
Adam whispered softly enough that he couldn't hear. "What? Why?"
"I don't know. He'd only talk to Sophie. And I'm not sure he's convinced Mrs. Potts or Chip are really alive."
Adam paused.
"And, well, I'm afraid if I get too close, he's going to wet himself."
Belle grimaced, though there was a hint of mirth in her eyes. "Oh, dear."
"You were much braver when we met,"
Adam went on, grinning a little. Just then Sophie re-emerged, moving immediately to Henry's side. "Are you ready?" she asked him quietly. Looking down at her, he sucked in a breath and nodded. Sophie took the man's hand, guiding him past the others and into the grand room. Line break. Henry had never seen the inside of the palace before, at least not beyond the kitchens. Yet he barely noticed the grand space around them. The books towering to the ceiling, the giant tree at the window. No. He was too busy searching the room for the people he believed dead 10 years ago.
"Mère?"
he asked, eyes scanning the space for a tea set, did Sophie say? "We were cursed by an enchantress, cursed to inhabit the last object we touched." He shook his head. It made no sense. All of this felt like a strange dream. Perhaps it was. "Over here, Henry." His eyes caught the teapot and its matching cup, feet moving on their own. He knelt before them, chest rising and falling in shock.
"Is it really you?" he asked. "Are you really?"
"It's us, love," the long-lost but familiar voice spoke. There was no denying that it was from the teapot itself. Painted porcelain patterns moving with the words.
"Mother," he repeated. "Oh, God! It really is you! And is this—"
He couldn't finish the words, looking down at the tiny cup, now staring up at him with wide painted eyes of its own. It is," she said softly. He reached out, hesitating for a brief moment, before touching the cup's delicate rim.
"Oh, love,"
Beatrice went on, sounding close to tears.
"I should have never believed you'd abandon us. I should have known there was a reason. I should never have given up on you," he said, his heart full of regret. "I've missed so much. Been gone all these years, when you needed me most. Oh, forgive me," he stammered, ducking his head to hide his trembling. "Forgive me."
He felt a nudge against his fingers a moment later. "Are you really my papa?" a boy's voice asked. Henry looked up again, watching as the child hopped closer of his own accord. Henry simply nodded. Forcing his hands to steady, he reached out, letting the boy hop onto his wide palms. He lifted him up slowly, fingers curling around his surface.
nervous the child might break with the slightest touch. He sure didn't like the look of that chip in the rim. At once the reality of it all flooded over him, and he pulled the child close to his chest. "Oh, my son!" he choked out, tears dripping into his beard. "You're here! You're really here!" The cup seemed to nestle closer to him. "Don't cry, Papa," the child said. "It's okay." His tears only flowed more freely at that, and Henry lifted Jack up, pressing a careful kiss onto his surface. In response, the boy giggled. "His moustache tickles, Mother!" Near the door, a small crowd observed in silence, permeated only by the occasional sniffle. Belle herself brought a hand to her heart, looking up at Adam with wet eyes. "I think Chip got the best gift this year," she said quietly.
"Yes," he breathed,
eyes not leaving the scene before him.
"He did."
Line break. After some time, everyone was beckoned back into the library. The holiday joy that had been felt before returning tenfold. Chip remained nestled in his father's hands, and though Henry's eyes were red from emotion, he soon had a wide grin spreading from ear to ear. Adam thought the man's smile looked quite like the one painted on the boy's porcelain surface.
"Henry, that beard is something else!"
Mrs. Potch chided in jest.
"I barely recognised you." "Well,
he scratched at the dark blonde bristles.
"You've changed a bit too, Mother." Everyone laughed at that.
They talked well into the evening, several plates of food from the night before being brought in to feed the tired father, as he recounted the events of the past decade, and answered a dozen questions from the others. "Papa, do you really make swords and spears like Mama said?" Chip asked.
Henry smiled proudly. "Sure do. Though mostly just a lot of horseshoes these days."
He chuckled. "Can I come watch?" the boy asked. "Please?"
"Oh, well,"
Henry started, looking down at his mother-in-law. Mrs. Potts looked quite nervous at the idea of her delicate grandson making a journey beyond the castle walls. Henry pursed his lips, then grinned.
"Tell you what, I'll bring my gear here and show you how it's done. How'd that sound?"
"Yes!" Chip cried, spinning excitedly in his father's palms. "Oh, Papa, want to see me do a trick?" Mrs. Potts shook her porcelain head, but poured some tea into Chip's cup regardless. As he proceeded to blow several bubbles up his rim, Belle turned to Adam. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Did none of you know what Victor had done?" Henry's hearty laugh rang out behind them, and Adam leaned down to respond.
"I figured he had proclaimed the grounds off limits, but I never imagined to declare the entire staff dead, or go to such great lengths to keep us hidden,"
he admitted quietly. He huffed, crossing his arms and sitting back. "Though I really shouldn't be surprised." "But couldn't you have known he was guarding the woods through the mirror?" Belle asked.
"I didn't get the mirror until I started to change," he explained. "That was 2 years later. And it sounds like Victor's troops had left just before then."
"Monsieur Pollard?" someone asked from behind them. Did anyone else come looking for us?" Adam turned to look at the others, and frowned. Most of the servants were single, or lived in the palace with their families, but several had at least some distant relations spotted across the countryside.
"I think so," Henry replied, "though I was away for the first few months. By the time I returned from my journey, most must have given up, being turned away by the guard. But," he trailed off, furrowing his brows, "there was one older man who was still coming then. Said he had a daughter who worked here. Clara? No,
He stopped, pursing his lips before raising a finger in triumph.
"Charlotte! Yes, that's the one!"
Adam stiffened. He barely registered Belle reaching for his arm.
"Guards threatened him too, of course," Adam went on. "Said if it weren't for his other kids back home, he'd have stayed to help me break in." "Say, she here?" he asked. "He's just down in Saint Amand. I bet I could locate him." Adam stared into his lap. The others had grown silent too. "No," he stated. "She's not here." Both of Belle's hands grasped his arm now, and she was looking up at him in concern. "I'm fine," he said quietly, sucking in a breath, trying not to think about how Charlotte might be still alive if her family had been allowed to come for her. Henry looked confused but didn't prod. "Well, anyway," he went on, looking down at the teacup in his hands, now sleeping quietly against his chest. "It's growing late. I suppose I ought to, Cogsworth,"
Adam said before he could finish.
Will you prepare a room for Henry? And see some bedclothes are laid out for him. Yes, master, right away.
Henry looked surprised for a moment, then smiled.
Great beast, he said. I've misjudged you.
Don't call him that,
Belle said earnestly, resting a protective hand on Adam's arm. Henry raised his brows, looking confused.
It's all right, Belle,
Adam said before turning back to the man.
In truth, I am also one of those affected by this curse, he admitted. You are? Henry asked. But who?
Adam grit his teeth.
He started, swallowing roughly.
Everyone had grown silent again, looking over at their master expectantly. None of them would reveal his identity. It was the master's secret after all. Adam tried again, unsure what he should say, what he wanted to say. He stood from his seat, chewing his lip, and stared out at the dark windows, before looking back down at Belle. Her eyes were full of encouragement, and his hesitation melted away in an instant. He knew who he was now, and he wasn't ashamed. Taking a deep breath, he stood tall and turned back to face Henry and the others.
I am Prince Adam, he proclaimed, son of King Alexander the Just, and Queen Jacqueline d'Averil, and the rightful ruler of this kingdom.
A quiet awe fell over the room.
Oh, my prince,
Lumiere said at last, bowing deeply before him.
You have returned to us.
Several others mimicked him quietly. Adam scratched the top of his head, suddenly unsure of how he was supposed to respond.
You're the little prince?
Henry asked. Adam raised his brows, looking back at him.
Wait, you remember me? The one who would run through the kitchens and sneak honeyscones from under Beatrice's nose? Ah! Henry laughed. Course I remember! My prince.
He brought an arm across his chest, fist to heart.
In honour of King Alexander, and for protecting my family all these years, I am forever at your service.
He stopped and nodded. It seemed the right thing to do.
Please, forgive me for my reaction earlier,
Henry went on, looking up timidly.
I admit, I thought you were going to eat me.
A few surrounding servants chuckled at that, the formality of the moment now gone.
Nah,
Adam shrugged, waving a paw in the air.
I much prefer Doc over Hume.
Oof! He grunted. Belle had just smacked him. He's joking, she told Henry earnestly, giving Adam the side eye. Henry laughed a bit, nervously. Oh, Henry, Sophie said, moving over beside him as she stood. You were really going to give up your horse for me? And fight him alone? She asked, resting a hand on his shoulder. How noble!
Well,
he shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck as his cheeks went a bit pink.
Anybody would have done it.
Adam raised his brows, looking down at Belle. She was watching the interaction, eyes alight and her hands clasped in front of her.
Hold on a minute, he whispered in confusion. How do those two know each other?
Line break.
You know, I waited weeks just to figure out your name. And you give Henry the whole thing right off?
Adam grinned sheepishly, looking up from the pages of one of Belle's books and glancing over at her. She lay one of her new brushes down to dry, a half-finished painting of the library resting against the easel that she was creating so Master Pascal could assess her current skill. It must have been made nearly in one morning, but she had been too eager to wait, setting up several candles to illuminate her work. Brushing her fingers against her old work apron, Belle pulled it off and set it aside, gliding over on light feet and settling beside him on the couch. She looked up, brows raised as she awaited his response.
Well, I never would have told him if it weren't for you, he admitted. You reminded me of who I was.
Her amusement changed to a soft smile.
You've done the same for me, I suppose.
I have?
She nodded, looking back at the easel with fondness.
I never thought I could. I don't know. Create something that would be remembered. Become someone what I was supposed to be.
Adam gave a half smile, reaching for one of her paint-stained hands.
Now, I'll be trained by a real Florentine artist, she whispered excitedly, looking back at him with bright eyes. I can't wait!
Adam laughed, noticing a dab of green paint on the side of her nose. He reached out, wiping it away carefully with his thumb. He held it up to show her.
Well, I can't wait to see you become a world-famous painter, he grinned.
She flushed. I'm not off to a good start, am I? She asked, though she couldn't hide her smile at his words as she pulled a handkerchief from her pocket and wiped the paint from his finger. I can't wait to tell Papa either, she mused. She suddenly stopped, looking troubled and staring at her lap.
You must listen,
Adam said quietly. Belle nodded silently. I feel like I've abandoned him. Right when he needs me most. She looked close to tears again, turning and resting her head against his sleeve.
That isn't your fault, he said gently. You said yourself the road was impassable.
I know, but I still feel that way. I never imagined when they left for Paris that Papa would be returning alone. She choked a bit on the last words, wrapping her arms around his, burying her face further in his shirt. Adam knew this kind of pain didn't go away quickly, and he knew sometimes there wasn't anything anyone could say to make it better. So instead, he reached out and ran his fingers over her head and through the ends of her hair. That had seemed to calm her in the past, and sure enough her quiet trembling had calmed within a couple of minutes. I'm sorry. You're probably so sick of me being like this, Belle said at last, voice muffled against him.
Belle, don't apologise for that. You can cry about it until you're 90, and I won't mind.
He froze, realising what he'd just said. Of course, he hoped they'd be together that long, but he hadn't meant to be so obvious about it. Belle, however, didn't seem to be bothered by the statement, merely hugging his arm tighter and sighing. I need to return to Molyneux tomorrow, she said a moment later.
What? He breathed.
Just for a day. And I still need to ask Genevieve if she and the boys will care for our home in my place. Thinking of Papa has reminded me I can't keep putting it off, even if I'd rather not go back. Then I can still have it off my chest until he returns in the spring. Adam only frowned, fearsome red eyes flashing in his mind. Sir Giles will be with me, remember? She said as though reading his thoughts. And I used to do this every day, and nothing happened.
Except running into the witch in disguise,
he noted. And did she do anything to me? Adam pouted.
I still don't like it.
Ah, Adam, Belle said, cocking her head in amusement. You can last a whole day without me, can't you?
No, that's not what I meant, he cried.
He stopped, however, humming to himself.
Though it probably will be the worst day ever.
Oh, brother! Belle laughed. You can finish that book and tell me what you think when I return.
I might finish too,
he said, picking back up the volume in his lap. It was open to a page about 2/3 of the way through. Slow down, she cried, though she looked pleased.
I can't, he admitted. It's too good.
Well, let's go to bed, so you can save some for tomorrow, she said, releasing his arm and moving to her feet.
All right,
Adam agreed as he followed. He forgot for the moment her decision to return to the town in the morning, simply grabbing her hand and leading her quickly towards the west wing, in hopes that a bit of mistletoe still hung above her door. Line break. A king's palace sat in a shallow mountain valley, surrounded by a frozen lake, its water dotted with paper lamps swinging gently along the wooden bridges that they bordered. This palace was nothing like the castle of her beast. No, for instead of cascading towers, a single flat roof sat atop the structure, curving delicately at the edges. Instead of stone walls, strong wooden beams divided the brick painted with intricate designs. Instead of armoured soldiers, soft-footed warriors patrolled the bridges, black sashes tied around their scalps and faces to protect them from the bitter winter air. The enchantress smiled. It was the latter she was interested in now. Few in the world knew of these skilled archers buried deep in the mountains of the Korean peninsula. They were a group selected from the bravest warriors, sworn to lead a life focused solely on the protection of their king, a life of celibacy, meaning that as long as they were true to their vows, the witch needed not worry whether her roses would take the proper effect. One of them approached, and she plucked a rose from her hair, tying into an intricate braid that fell to her waist. The warrior slowed as she came near, then stopped, eyes drooping at the scent. The witch emerged from the bushes, letting a crooked grin grace her features.
She says something here in Korean. I don't speak Korean. She ordered in his tongue, using a bit more magic for the communication. Bring the others. The man nodded dumbly as she tucked the rose into his tunic, then turned on his heel and took off at a silent sprint back the way he had come. The enchantress walked up to the lake's edge, the ice covering with a fresh layer of snow. She inhaled deeply and then blew out, her breath strengthened by her magic and leaving a clear, perfect reflection in the frozen surface. A moment later, her victims approached. She let her remaining roses open in full bloom, filling the air with their scent. The warriors all sagged at once. All, that is, except one lone man near the front.
Who are you? He asked in his language. What are you doing here?
The witch cocked her brow. Oh, she observed in amusement. How interesting. Tell me, Gionsa, what's her name? The man's eyes grew wide, the only part of his face visible beneath his winter wraps. There is one you love, no? The enchantress asked. Quite strange, considering the oath of celibacy you've made. The man's eyes narrowed back to angry slits, letting out a heavy breath that puffed into the midnight air. What are you? He asked again, whipping out a bow and knocking an arrow with a blink of an eye. Why, I'm the enchantress of the West, she corrected herself quickly. It would be west to these men, wouldn't it? He released the sinew bowstring, but she merely flicked her wrist and put up an invisible shield to protect herself. The arrow bounced off, landing in the thick snow, and Circe grinned, relishing her new abundance of strength. She frowned a moment later, however, thinking of how much power she could have if she had spent the last several years building it up instead of leaping ahead. 10 whole years was just so long to wait to see if her plan to fruition. But the time had been necessary to make her beast sufficiently desperate. Though all it seemed to have done was give him a chance to actually break the blasted spell behind her back. She huffed. That was ridiculous. Even if he loved that peasant, there was no way the girl could ever love him back. He was hideous, after all. Surely she was merely sticking around for the free meals and dresses. Satisfied, she looked back at the warrior before her. He'd released a few more arrows during her brief musings, which now surrounded the ground at her feet. The vapour out of his breath had now stopped. He stood stone still in shock. The enchantress smirked. Kill him, she ordered the others. She turned towards the water, touching the reflective surface and letting it dissolve into the vision of mist as her new recruits obeyed her orders. Enjoy yourself now, my dear beast, she said absently, pulling another blood-red rose from her hair and staring at it fondly. For you too will soon do as I wish. End of chapter, and Merry Christmas, my lovely listeners. Oh my God, what a chapter. That was amazing. The memories. Gaston, I want to punch him so badly. But of course, the pièce de résistance in French. Henry going to the palace, wanting to give up his freedom to save Sophie when he thought she was in danger, and meeting Chip and being so welcomed and seeing Mrs. Potts again. Yes. Oh my God, my heart. Yes. And as I've said before, Christmas is my favourite time of year. So even if you do not celebrate it, please know my best wishes are with you right now. Enjoy this lovely time of year, all of you, please. And have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Remember to like, comment and subscribe. And I will see you in another video, my guys, gals and non-binary pals. Merry Christmas again. Bye!